Thanks for coming out today. I know it's sort of that time where the semester's ended and you're like kind of realizing that you're a real person again. I'm almost there. I'm really excited to be a real person again, but I'm not there yet. I'm excited to talk with you guys today. I know some of you. I don't know all of you. If you know me or you talk to me on the phone, it's probably in the context of academic integrity, which is what I do in the College of Arts and Sciences, in addition to working on the faculty in the literature department. In academic integrity, I hear from faculty, I work with students, I sort of manage the process of adjudication when students have violated or are thought to have violated the academic integrity code. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that today, although I think what the workshop will sort of touch on is that design for assignments and thoughts about how we grade and evaluate are all of a piece, and academic integrity kind of participates in that. Assignments that are well designed, evaluations that are clear, design for evaluations that are clear, encourage students to submit original work, to understand in a really transparent way what the relationship between submitting work and getting grades on work really is all about. I threw this Bear Grylls picture in at the end, which probably says something about how some of us might feel about grading. But the description of the session that you saw and that you responded to is that we'd initiate some discussion about grading as a pedagogical act, and that's really what I mean, initiate discussion. Unfortunately, there's no miracle towards getting through a stack of fill-in-the-blank papers, lab reports, whatever the assignment is, quickly. I don't have any real strategies for making that process easier, faster, more fun, but I think initiating discussion with each other, with your colleagues constantly, is a way to get yourself through some of the challenges and make the way you evaluate students more part of your pedagogy and less that thing that you do after you've carried around a stack of papers for a week, which is what I do. So grading is important. Everybody, certainly our students know that. We know that. We feel pressure from a lot of different areas on grading. The Derek Bach Center, which is like our CTRL, is at Harvard, says grading is among the most meaningful tasks we undertake as teachers, and it's one that even when things are going smoothly can require what feels like outsized amounts of time and energy. And really, I think this is what a lot of faculty sort of talk to me about when it comes to grading. It takes so much time. It takes so much sort of brain engagement with what you're doing. But I thought it'd be useful if we just kind of purged a little and talked about what some of those challenges are for you. Like, what are some of the things that you feel like take the most time, but also energy when you're grading or evaluating student work? What is it that you think takes that from you?
The nebulous concept of fairness.
Fairness. Oh, we have a thing today.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not a multiple choice, it's very much a qualitative assessment of sort of like what's right or what's good.
Yeah. So the thought that like there's some subjectivity there. Yeah. Fairness. Okay. Good. What else?
Like just making sure that all the components on the rubric are actually in the paper. So like I have the rubric and then the paper and I'm like back and forth, checking off all the elements, because that's the other thing, to try to make it as objective as possible. That's the first thing that I check for, is that all the components are there, and then I have to go into whether they're high quality or not.
Yeah. So so if you're using a rubric, there's often a sort of two-step process that involves kind of making sure that all this is met, and then there's another layer to it. Okay. Good. Other things that you think?
Making sure there's useful feedback for those students.
Yeah. Yeah, the sort of learning component?
Yeah.
Yeah. It takes us a while to sort of get to that because there's so much, I mean, all of it's about learning, right? But this idea of fairness and managing subjectivity often is what takes like the kind of, I don't want to say emotional labor, but certainly it is energy. And then there's this sort of like, well, what are students going to do with this? How are they going to use it to sort of do something meaningful. There's a lot there. And that's all nice. Oh, sorry, that didn't get formatted right. That's all nice. Like all of these things. These challenges are real, and I think I'm gonna. Is there a way I can get rid of this? Close that. There. Great. Some of the other challenges that are kind of big picture are ones that I think everybody's familiar with too. I mean, grade inflation is something that we've been talking about as a university, and even departmentally for a number of years. These are pressures that we face, not only to be fair, but also to be mindful of kind of how our grades are representing value. And certainly there are arguments like this. This is Susan Blum, who writes a lot about grading. Her argument is that grades get in the way of student learning, that students are so fixated on the grade-related outcome, they're not able to actually focus on what's happening in the work. They're not able to transfer that conceptual knowledge or those specific skills because they're so obsessed with the outcome. And certainly with the cost of education and all that students do to make that happen, it's understandable. These are arguments I can't really get into, but I think worth kind of percolating on. I have a lot of slides here that just kind of screenshot different resources that I think are useful for grading and responding to student work, whether it's here are some example rubrics, or here are some approaches, or here are some things to think about. The Bach Center, which I already mentioned, is one, and there'll be a couple peppered sort of throughout. The other one that I like is at Cornell, which is at their Center for Teaching Innovation. They have a lot of useful stuff about rubrics, conversations about rubrics. You mentioned a rubric. Has everybody used a rubric? Some yes, some no. Okay. There are, what do you think are some of the benefits of rubrics for those of you who have used them or thought of using them or had them used even when you were a student? Consistency. Yeah.
Students really want to know what you expect, and you think you're explicit, but it's like for them, unless there's a rubric, you're not explicit.
Yeah, so students, so there's two, like, kind of, there's a timeline there, right? It's like when you're grading, the rubric gives you an opportunity to sort of be more fair or more objective and more consistent. But then before the assignment, a student can see on paper sort of how they'll be evaluated, can know explicitly sort of how their work will be reviewed. So rubrics kind of offer that too.
Yeah, I would be curious, maybe later on, it doesn't fit now, but to see or learn how people are using rubrics, right? Are they using them as just kind of handing them out to see this is how I'm evaluated, or do they also become part of the feedback? Like, here's your paper with the rubric and where I think you fell in this. Because I think maybe they have different implications also for your relationship with the students and the papers.
Yeah, you're right. So rubrics have a lot of different opportunities. There's a lot of opportunity in using rubrics for teaching. Not just as a, like, it helps me grade, or it helps students know before they submit the assignment what the expectations are, but also, ideally, the rubric should have something specific enough that when you fill it out or you highlight it, or in the writing program we have a rubric, and a lot of instructors will highlight portions of the rubric that apply to the work they're looking at. So like, there might be a sentence in the A category, a sentence in the B category, right? And so the student kind of knows, like, oh, my transitions were weak, but my overall organization was strong. Okay, I need to work on, right? And so there's some kind of teaching tools in this level of specificity and how you provide the feedback. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. Before we do that, what do you think some weaknesses of using rubrics might be?
I think sometimes the students rely on them so much that you just get this formulated kind of response instead of kind of them delving in on their own and being creative.
Yeah, I really struggle with rubrics. I think it negatively impacts learning.
Yeah.
But like they are so adamant about it, so I go back and forth. So sometimes I provide what I think is a detailed paragraph of what I expect. They submit it, and then in Blackboard, as I'm grading, I create a rubric that goes in line with what I said in the paragraph, but didn't necessarily tell them in advance maybe how I'd weight things or that sort of thing. I don't know. I mean, because I want them to have, I don't know.
I don't want to sound like that cranky professor, but like I never had rubrics, and I learned a lot in college, you know, and so like
Yeah.
I don't understand. It's like teaching to the test mentality, and I want them to have some like creativity and like
then
some room
you
to
know,
grow.
Along with that, it makes it hard for you to kind of, you're reading something, I really want to take off a point for that, but can I if it's not specified in the rubric? Will they come back at me and say, well, you didn't say that, but I was like, but it's really not, or like, you know, it's not great here, but if it's not specified in the rubric, can I take points off, or can I, so kind of, you can get into this gray area of like, on top of the rubric, can I take things off, or are they going to just come back and be like, you didn't say that, you know, so.
Yeah.
One of the challenges that I've had with rubrics is how to weigh things, right? What's the main point and stuff. I mean, there's a tendency I have a tendency to be like, okay, you know, like the kind of, some of the kind of mechanics aspect shouldn't be like so weighty, but then it's like, if it's so poorly mechanics-wise, then, you know, it's like the whole thing falls apart. So I just have a lot of issues figuring out how to fairly weight what should be worthwhile overall in those rubrics.
And sometimes that's one of those things that you have to learn the hard way too, right? Like you get the assignment back and you're like, oh God, I shouldn't have put so much weight on that thing, because everyone either did really well on that and that was like a dumb thing to weigh so heavily, or everyone did really poorly on that and I didn't give it enough attention, right? There's a lot of kind of our own stuff. And I think too, Adele, you said, I was thinking about this, we do a lot of like justifying of a grade, in part because we're like, oh, please don't send me that email, please don't send me that email, right? Because that's the worst, like that interaction. There's almost like a sort of, I didn't pay for an A, I paid, you know, I didn't pay for a C, I paid for an A, or like but I did everything on the rubric, but I came in and talked to you and you said, and so I thought that meant, right? And so there's some really delicate kind of interpersonal interactions there. And so maybe part of it comes with a rubric isn't everything. It can't be everything, and it can't, not only can it limit creativity, it certainly can limit the ways we could reward creativity, right? Because it can't account for it, right?
I was going to say, and you were just saying it doesn't account for everything. After my first semester here, I started, I would check with the students who took my class before, and I would provide samples along with the rubric. I don't know, though, if that necessarily stifles the creativity, because now you have a rubric, you have a sample. But what I did in one class is I had them take the rubric and a few sample assignments and pick out like what was in the rubric that was in the assignment so that they could see. And I asked the former students permission, but I wanted them to kind of start to, in their mind, see what this assignment looked like on the other end. And I had different samples. The only problem is I told the students I wasn't trying to show them an exemplar so that they wouldn't like try to, you know, copy it verbatim, but I did want them to see samples along with the rubric, because I think the rubric gives you like a conceptual understanding of it, or kind of this, it's a little nebulous, but when you see the finished product and you compare the finished product to the rubric, I think that kind of gave them more of a concrete understanding of what the assignment should look like.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. And it also shows that, you know, another way of using rubrics, and there are a couple of different variations on that theme, right? So identify parts of the rubric you see in this sample paper. Or here are 2 sample papers. Both of them are good, but both of them tackle the assignment really differently. How does the rubric kind of apply to both of those things? Now they can see a sort of spectrum of possibility in the assignment. I also have done like having students use the rubric to grade something so that they can kind of like see how it works that way. If you do that, it's a lot of like, students love the sort of anonymous paper that they get to like tear to shreds, you know what I mean? So it's a different thing. I've also used it as a sort of workshopping tool, so like for peer review or for a workshop, where it's kind of like, don't use this to grade someone. Use this to kind of direct the constructive feedback you give to someone, because this has the themes and the topics and the issues, the skills, the concepts that are important in this assignment. You can use it to direct the feedback you have. So when you can use the rubric as an in-class activity, an outside of class assignment, sort of before the assignment is even kind of in construction, then it's adding another level of sort of teaching. And the conversation of like, is this useful? How is it useful? How is it not? Does it limit you? How does it limit you? Like, actually have that conversation with students. I've also had my students build a rubric before, where I've given them an assignment, kind of like what you're describing, where I've laid out explicitly all the expectations of the assignment. We've read a ton of examples, we're ready to go, and part of the goal of the assignment is sort of like understanding a genre. And so by that time, they're actually ready to create a rubric. They work in groups to each do a section, and then they have to review other people's sections and agree as a class on the rubric. It's a little dangerous because I could get into a situation where I'm committed to a rubric that I don't feel good about. Like I was only brave enough to do it after I taught the assignment a number of times, right? But it's been a really great activity. Some students at first are like, what? You're supposed to be doing that work, you know? But in the end, they'll be like, oh yeah, this really actually helped me understand, like, what is this assignment? What am I doing here? But also, like, how do we think about how things are constructed, and how do we determine whether something's good or not? It takes that subjectivity away, right? It's not like I'm doing this because I want the professor to like it. That's the other part too, right? I get good grades and the professor likes my stuff. It's like, no. In the particular assignment I'm talking about, it's like, oh, it's a genre. It's a kind of writing that's separate from what I like or who I am. I didn't make it up. And if you do something that I don't like, it doesn't matter. If you've met the expectations of the genre, if we can look at that and say it's a fill in the blank, then great. One of the things that I think is really important is, I think I mentioned this earlier when I talked about academic integrity, that sort of all of this is of a piece. And I kind of think of a rubric as like one track on an album, like one song on an album that has like, but I'm talking like album like before iTunes, you know, where like albums were sort of units of thought, you know, like where you've got kind of things that go together and when put together form a larger picture. Every assignment is part of this suite. Everything that you are including in your class should contribute to the main message. And so your assignments and your rubrics should be working together. They should use the same language. You should be, using. You should be thinking about these questions about what it would look like to do well on the assignment. What would it look like for a student to meet the minimum requirements in terms of thinking about a rubric? That's kind of like the thinking about those are the easiest way in. What is the best version of this look like? Am I willing to accept other versions of this that could be awesome? And what does it mean to meet the minimum requirements? And putting that on an assignment sheet is a really good idea. The minimum requirements of this assignment: you need this many pages, it needs to have this many sources, it needs to have an argument, it needs to, right, if there are 4 things, 3 things, 5 things, my advice is always don't kitchen sink an assignment, just because it makes, it's hard, it's a lot harder for students, and you know a lot less about what's coming out. So the example I just gave you, the assignment where I had them write the rubric, I told you it was the genre. It's a genre called the explainer, and I'm using genre really loosely here, but you've probably seen explainers written in various news outlets. The one I use is from slate.com. It's basically explaining an answer to a question about the day's news. And so students have to come up with a question based in recent news, and they have to find scholarly sources or expert sources that help explain the answer. Very simply, very succinctly. So it's a really short, it's like 800 words max. There's no argument, it's just, here's a question, here's the answer from experts. And so for me, it's prioritizing skills. Like, can you find sources that are experts? Do you know what an expert is? Can you integrate that into writing? Can you use citation to indicate what sources you're using? Can you write succinctly and clearly to answer a specific question? So it's really targeted. It's not asking for argument. It's not really about organization. It's not really about mechanics. It's really about can you answer a question using research, and can you put that together in a succinct way? I mean, there's nuances in there that I'm not getting into. But because I'm not incorporating everything, now my rubric is a little bit smaller, it's a little bit more manageable. They know it's like they don't have to do everything. They just have to focus on these particular skills. So for me, the minimum requirements of the assignment there are, well, you have to have a question. It has to come from recent news. No, news from 5 years ago is not recent. That does not meet the minimum requirements of the assignment, right? You have to have experts talking in your piece. If somebody's quoting their friend, if they're not an expert in something, it's not relevant. No, not meeting the minimum requirements of the assignment. It has to be a particular length. If it's 2 pages, 6 pages, no, it doesn't meet the minimum requirements of the assignment, right? So I'm trying to be clear with students about what the minimum requirements look like. And being clear about that in the assignment. Not just the major requirements and the expectations of this particular project, but also in the assignment sheet, how does it fit into the bigger picture? So I say to students, this is the first assignment of the semester. Guess what? I'm going to expect that for the second one, you know what experts are, you know how to find them, you know how to integrate them into your writing, you know how to write succinctly, and you know how to organize research in response to something. Now, in the next assignment, I can ask them to write an argument, because now they've kind of like built some skills that I can ask them to use for that. And so I tell them that. We're not going to like do this same thing again. I'm going to ask you to use these skills. So if you don't know what's going on, or if you don't do well on this, you've got to get a hold of these skills so that on the next thing, you're in good shape. There are lots of rubric tools that allow you to create things that are right for you in terms of what things say and how things work. There's tools for building rubrics. There's tools and advice for kind of using rubrics in the classroom. Wisconsin Stout has a good set of tools for creating your own rubrics. A lot of these are electronic. The Word doc one, the third one from the top, is the one I used for my students to create their own. But there are a couple of rubric generators. Rubistar is one, which sounds kind of like it's like a casino or something. But here you can choose a type of assignment. They give you templates. So like if you're doing an assignment for the first time, for example, or you're teaching a new class that you've never done before, you know what I mean? It can be useful to kind of open a template, see what they have. You can change any or all of it, but it can be useful to see what kind of projects they're writing templates for, what kind of templates they have, stuff like that. So that can be useful. We kind of got at this a little bit. This is from Cornell's page. Some of the other uses that they mentioned here are ones that we got at. Having students use the rubric to do some kind of peer review or workshop, using rubrics to assess their own work, evaluating teamwork for oral presentations. They can use them for self-assessment at the end or early on in the project. And there's some samples here. So I'd encourage you to check out, there's a lot of really great advice about rubrics on Cornell's site, but there's also a lot of really great examples of rubrics here on Carnegie Mellon's Teaching Excellence Center. They have a lot of useful samples for a huge variety of projects, everything from your standard kind of research paper to group projects, oral presentations, individual projects, podcasts, all that. And they have a lot of advice for sort of designing assignments that are not, like, let's say, quote, non-traditional. And that can be useful, too, if you're thinking of developing a rubric. Because sometimes you get to a place where you've developed an assignment and you've given it out, and now you're like, oh, it helped to have a rubric. I'm going to try to make a rubric, and then I'll share it with students, right? And you're like, oh, this assignment is not at all what I wanted it to be, or this assignment isn't really like ready to be rubricified, and so it really, like I said, tracks on an album. It's sort of all of a piece. So I have some sample assignments that I wanted to share with you as a way to kind of start a conversation about how you could use an assignment to start building a rubric, what that would look like, why you would do it, why you wouldn't do it, but also what about the assignment makes a rubric sort of easier to create or more difficult to create, and thinking about sort of what that process would look like. So we don't have enough time where I can kind of ask you to create a rubric and see how that feels. But I do think it's useful instead to have a conversation about like, what would it be like if I tried to create a rubric for this particular assignment. I think it helps kind of reflect a little bit about assignment design, but also about when a rubric might be useful or how you could modify a rubric to suit the needs and the concerns even that you have. And I have a bunch of different assignments, but I thought it would be good to have people working together. So I'll pass out the assignments, take a couple of minutes to read through. Some of them are a little bit longer, so bear with me. We have enough time. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Let's hear from everyone and see. I think from overhearing conversations, it seems like this is an activity where critiquing the actual assignment is pretty hard not to do, right? I heard some critiques of assignments, right? So let's start with the question of sort of what about the assignment made it challenging to even think about creating a rubric from it?
Well, in our case, it was a group presentation, so always difficult to sort of break down how you judge individuals within a group.
Okay.
Here's a 5 versus.
So just the kind of assignment that it was.
Yeah.
And did the assignment like say stuff about the expectations, or did you feel like the assignment had enough kind of there to be able to draw something out of in terms of a rubric, or?
I mean, there's enough here for a rubric to kind of get a rubric out there, but there's so many moving parts to this assignment. There's a lot of parts. Like this assignment has a proposal, a final presentation, and a written part to it, so you would have to break out rubrics for just about every little part of it, and then how do you make all the rubrics kind of flow together so they're kind of building on each other and don't contradict each other, and it's kind of,
Yeah. This assignment was one that had a bunch of different moving parts. It was for a marketing class,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you were a student reading that assignment, could you tell what the priorities were?
Not really.
Because it was
Yeah.
too much. It was
Yeah.
too
It's a
much.
lot
way
in
too
one
much.
place.
Yeah.
So an assignment sheet, so you guys had a big one too, right? The community study.
Yeah.
Talk
Yeah.
a little bit about the sort of size and prioritization there, and we'll see if we can kind of contrast.
Yeah, well, one thing we were talking about, like this is basically a 7-week-long assignment, and each week has sort of different objectives and different pieces to it. So we similarly were saying that you would basically have to have a separate rubric for each.
And then perhaps in the final rubric, when they have to submit their final assignment, refer to previous rubrics as they were completed and they received a passing grade, so that just reminds students that you can't just sort of, semi-complete earlier assignments and just focus on submitting something at the end.
So if there's an assignment that has building blocks in it, students can find it useful to get that whole thing at once, but it can be really overwhelming to get it all at once, especially if the sort of priorities aren't clear. Like in that one, I feel like the presentation part is buried at the end, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, and then do a presentation.
Mhm.
What? Like, do I need to
Yeah.
slides and things and visuals and and so while it's substantial, it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of specific information to go on. I think I heard one of you guys say that.
Yeah.
But in the back, you guys had a good amount of substance laid out week by week in a sort of timeline rather than a like this and then this and then this and then this and then this. And so that it kind of made a little more sense, especially if there would be a rubric for each part. One alternative to that too, and this is something that I've done a few times, is in a lot of my classes, I'll have a project that starts in like the beginning of October and ends, at the end of the semester. But it has lots of different parts to it. And so I'll tell them at the beginning, this is all leading to one place, and that place is you're going to write a scholarly article. But I really don't want you to know that or think about that, because that'll kind of put you in a territory where you're doing something like making an argument where you actually know something about something, because that's a sort of like high school way of doing things. So I have them sort of go through the process, and I only tell them about the part of the process that we're on. Like they know sort of where we're headed, but I don't give them an assignment sheet with that end point right away, because it's too much, but also their process will be upended by trying to think too far ahead on it. You know what I mean? And so even one year what I did was I had them, after a little bit of research, write down what they think their argument would be, and then I had them roll it up into a ball and throw it in the garbage can. And then they left, and then I went to the garbage can and I picked out all the pieces of paper, which is very creepy, and I put it in a bag and I tied it up. And then once we got 6 weeks further on, I brought in a bag of trash and had them all find their arguments and compare. And it's like, oh yeah, this was a garbage argument that I would make before I actually knew anything about anything. And so the way I parsed out these, or stretched out the assignment had significance to what I was trying to teach them, which is that you can't make an argument until you know stuff. It makes no sense. So think about some of those elements of design and how rubrics fit into those elements of design. You can make really small rubrics, and they don't all have to look like what we think of rubrics looking like. What about some of the other assignments that you guys saw?
So ours was relatively short, but one of the challenges I think is there was an emphasis in specific, because, so I don't know if you can see, but it has all the different parts that this lab report or lab paper has to have,
Yep.
and each of them has like a number of points that they will get for that part. So it really emphasizes each of those parts overall, like neglecting the cohesion of the whole thing. And so it was really challenging, because then it's like, it almost kind of signals to students, as long as you have like each of these parts, you do it without really emphasizing the way the things should connect to each other, or the quality of the writing and all that. So we saw that as a particular challenge in the way that this assignment is like presented visually. Right?
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. The visuals of an assignment, even the arrangement of things, should also communicate things to students, right? So it's like if you talk about grammar at the top of the page, that signals that that's a priority of the assignment, right? It signals that it's important. If grammar gets 8 points and other things get 7 points, it signals that grammar is more important. And so those all come with sort of messages, arrangement and layout and design. There's one, I can't remember which one of them, uses boldface type. I think it was the podcast one. The podcast one says, it highlights, you are highly encouraged to interview other people, which is in bold. And so as a reader, my eye is really directed towards that bold text. And I'm like, okay, as a student, I've got to interview other people, right? But then next to it in non-bold, it says, you're highly encouraged.
Right.
Which is a
it
student.
required or not? Like, it's confusing.
Yeah, as a student, I'm like, well, that means I don't actually have to interview other people, right? And so be careful with what you're doing with this sort of like elements of design. It seems so small, but if you're going to bold interview other people, then it should probably be a requirement. If you're going to put it in the list of goals, then it probably shouldn't be like a try this. It should probably be a this is necessary kind of thing. And so think about sort of where things go, how things are arranged on the page. Because if you have that buried in there and you're highly encouraged, well, now you can't evaluate that fairly, right? Because the students who do interviews, you're like, great, good job, great interview. But the students who didn't, well, you didn't tell them they had to, you know? Other thoughts about the podcast one?
There's a portion there that says, it is rather difficult to get an A for this assignment without doing at least one interview.
Yeah.
So it's quite confusing for a student to know, like, okay, so I need to do one, but at least one. So how many do I need to do? So we have to be really specific as to how many outside information we need to obtain.
Yeah. One thing that I think is cool about this conversation is that whether or not like a rubric gets made for this assignment is up to you. But the process of thinking about what would it be like if I made a rubric identifies some weaknesses in the assignment. Like, I guess I actually do want them to do an interview, and I think I should require that. And I'm a little wishy-washy on it, so maybe I should be clearer about it. So even just the process of thinking about a rubric, if you don't end up using it, fine. But just thinking about like, what would it look like if I made one, might identify some of the kind of significant communication issues in an assignment. It's so easy to kind of have those.
Something that I do is I copy my assignments sheet into a new document, and then as I get student questions, I like edit my assignment sheet for the next time that I'm gonna
That's a
teach
great
it
idea.
because I never remember, and then I'm like, oh, I got this question last time or
Yeah.
whatever, you know.
That's a great idea.
And I like. It's something I'm just doing this semester, so we'll see how I implement it, the new assignment sheet next year.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
because I feel like I said earlier, you know, I think I'm very clear.
Yeah.
And then they have all these questions, and I don't understand why, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's helping me figure out how I can be clearer.
Yeah, that's great. As soon as when you're doing the assignment is when you'll remember it best, not a couple weeks later. So any way you can think of to take notes that make sense for you while it's happening, of the questions that are coming up, or maybe some of the ideas you have for the next time you do the assignment. Yeah, great idea. What was the assignment that you guys had?
This was the one-page weekly response paper. Very detailed, so I don't know if you guys can see. It's got 2.5 pages, and it ends with do's and don'ts. And we felt like it really lended itself to rubric making because it's like very, very clear of what they want.
Yeah.
There is the use of bold. I would be overwhelmed as a student because it's a lot, and I would have to read it like 17 times to make sure that I did all the things.
Yeah. This is a hard balance to strike, right? Because in many ways that's awesome because it's like this is your contract with the student, right? But it's also, think too about how length conveys something about the assignment and its significance, right? Like if that response paper assignment is like 1 of 10 that are worth 5% of the grade and it's a 2-page assignment, like you're doing too much. Like writing 2 pages worth of assignment for something that's worth like 1% of a grade, yikes, too much. It means that also that students aren't getting that message about where to put all their eggs, you know what I mean? And so think about how assignment length kind of shares something about the value. Like the biggest assignment in your class is probably the one that's the longest. A response paper, you probably need to condense it, but the do's and don'ts are helpful. It's a little bossy, the language of it, but it's also helpful. That kind of language and that kind of mood, the sort of like, here's what a successful assignment looks like, check, 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 are useful for assignments that you're not going to be able to spend a huge amount of time on, like a weekly response paper where you're getting however many students you have every week for you're not going to like read, God bless you if you are, but you're not going to really look at those with a fine-tooth comb. The goal is, did you read the thing? Do you have something to say about it? You do? Cool, go, bye, right?
Did you not summarize?
Did you not, right. And so that's a situation where a rubric can really help and where language like that can really help. Same with things like annotated bibliographies, sometimes lab reports, if they're very clear things that need to get met, and it's like, did you do this? Did you not do this? Did you do that? Did you not do this? You could even stretch it out into, did you do it really well? Did you meet the minimum requirements? Did you not meet the minimum requirements? Now you have a sort of a sliding scale for kind of main components of the assignment. Response papers also, I should say, whenever it comes up with faculty, I think it's really important for me to mention, a lot of the academic integrity cases I see involve response papers. It's an oft assigned genre because I think faculty want to make sure that students are doing the reading, but also in the pedagogical sense that students figure out something and think something about the readings they're doing. But the first thing students do when they don't understand a text is they go over to old Google and type it in. And sometimes this is an innocent thing in the sense of, in a confidence way, right? Like, there's no way I can have anything cool to say about Aristotle. I'm going to go find somebody smarter than me who's going to say something about Aristotle. I'm just going to get some ideas. And that translates really quickly into, poorly paraphrased material, or even just taking someone else's ideas without attribution. And so I would caution you in a response paper to be very clear about what is and isn't acceptable in terms of source use, how students should be attributing material from the web. I would explain to students why, if you don't want them to use any material from outside sources, why? Because then sometimes students are like, well, he said don't cite anything. It's like, he didn't mean don't cite it if you use it. He meant don't use it. He meant respond with your brain. Read what you read and think something about it, right? And so that's sometimes confusing. Also, I see the other side of this, and so some of that is legitimate, and some of it, but just like a sort of word to the wise about response assignments.
I do the thing where say, I don't care about anybody else's argument. I want your argument here, the allowable things. Here's something you're not supposed to use, and I explain. I don't care if I'm not grading this other person's response to yours. So that's a good point. And you also have to reiterate why you're allowing or not allowing something.
Yeah. And that's another, I would give that advice really for any assignment, that the more you can say about sort of why are we doing this, students really, like you said, they don't always pick up what you're putting down in terms of like the way you organize things or how clear you've been. A lot of what I teach students when they first get to me is about reading, and I'm sure if any of you have any kind of reading in your class at all, you find that students' reading skills have become weaker. It's a nationwide trend. Part of it, I think, is because students often don't understand, A, that there are multiple ways to read things, but B, that the first thing they should know is why they're reading the thing. They've really been taught to read in just one way, which is hoover up information. Like, that's kind of the approach to reading that they generally take. Whereas that's not really how I want them to read. I want them to read like writers. So they can kind of like be like an architect looking at a building. How is this put together? How did somebody make this? Why did somebody make these decisions? That's really different from the kind of reading they are going to do in another class, where they may be reading for information, or they may be reading to engage with arguments. They may be reading to be inspired by something. They may write lots of different ways to read. So the more you can tell students in an assignment sheet and then reflect in a rubric the reasons they're doing the thing they're doing. Here's why I'm asking you to read this text. And I do tell my students, it's not like bad to ask your professor, can you tell me why we're reading this? Like, that's an okay question, So those are some things to think about. Other things that came up from your conversations that you felt like were useful that you wanted to share about the value of making a rubric or the value of talking about making a rubric?
I do a lot of community-based learning, and reflection is a big part of that. It's like a requirement.
Yeah.
And I cannot figure out how to grade or rubric a reflection. Yeah. So basically they get A's if they answered the prompts, but because it's like you're not deep enough. Like, I don't know how to. Do you have any suggestions on reflection?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up reflections, because reflection can be a useful tool for the project.
It's more that I want them to do it. I don't actually care. It's more for them to sit and reflect. Yeah. But then they need a break. I don't know. Maybe they do pass fail or something.
I think that's a possibility. I think reflections come into play also in group projects, or oral presentations can be really useful, because then somebody's going to say something about what it was like to interact with others. There's some skills involved in reflection that students don't necessarily have, right? And so you not only have to attend, you have to attend to those skills in the classroom. What does it look like to reflect? What am I really asking you to do when I'm asking you to reflect? And so the more specific you can be about what you're hoping that reflection sort of looks like, what does it mean to reflect, and why are we doing it? So maybe you want them to refer to the course texts. Maybe you want them to bring in some of their outside experience. Maybe you want them to connect to another class at AU. Maybe you want them to find a text and refer to it that isn't part of the course, right? The more specific you can be about what the reflection should do, the better. So that might involve thinking about, I don't know, I would maybe even start with your own experience. What kinds of reflections in this context have been the most positive and helpful and useful for you? Oh, those have been reflections where I'm actually engaging with my own weaknesses, shortcomings, challenges. I don't know, it probably depends on the situation, right? But if you can identify some of the things that you want them to really wrestle with in a reflection, you'll get the most out of it, and you'll be able to evaluate it more successfully. But I do think, pass-fail on a reflection is optional, but it does suggest that it's not all that important. You know what I mean? Or that it's like a personal thing, and you do you. You know what I mean? Maybe making a reflection in a variety of formats, enabling a variety of formats. Maybe if it's personal, maybe the reflection is in writing, but maybe the reflection is, into a tape recorder, as a video, or it's an email or it's a tweet or it's a blog or it's a, like maybe enabling other kind of mediums for that kind of thing. But I would definitely suggest if there's a reflection and it matters and you want it to be like part of the grade, and I think it can be. I think reflections are meaningful tools. Then a kind of rubric for that might look like a couple of bullet points of like, this is what you need to do in your reflection. In fact, one half of my final exam is a reflection letter to me, where students have to write, "Dear Professor Thomas," and I tell them like, I don't want any like, "I love you so much," I do kind of want that at the end of the semester, I'm not gonna lie, but like, that's not what I want from this letter. What I want from this letter is, I want to know what was hard for you when you got here. I want to know what's still hard. I want to know what you wish you did differently and why. I want to know what text you thought was the most useful. What text did you think was the least useful? I want to know why, right? I'm like, it's a really detailed, it's a page long, because it's part of their final exam. And so I say, you're welcome. If you really engage with this, it's not easy to do, but you have it all in here. I'm not asking you to go sit at the library for 10 hours and do some research. For some of you, that'll be easier or harder, but the more detail you can give, if it's a significant thing, then the better. Thanks, I'm really glad you brought that up. The last thing I guess I should mention too is publishing expectations in multiple places, whether it's a rubric or assignments. I do see a lot of students who are like, I didn't get the assignment. What? You just wrote this paper and you submitted it and you didn't even have the assignment? I've seen this in the past week. So if you've got, make an assignment sheet. Make sure it expresses your goals for the assignment, long-term and short-term. Put it on Blackboard. Put it in their hands on paper. Put it on their, tattoo it on the, whatever. Make sure that every student has access to the assignment. I mean, there's only so much you can do, right? But you've got to make sure that it's available with a timeline that makes sense for your goals. Like I said, that doesn't mean necessarily at the beginning of the project. So I thought I would I've got a bunch of examples of rubrics just from all over, from some of the sites that I showed you already. This one is linked from Wisconsin. I'll give them to Anna and she'll put them on Blackboard and send them out. This is just an example of a Twitter post. And this person uses points. This is I just wanted to kind of put this suite of things together just really quickly. This, you don't have to read this, but it's just to show you sort of this part of my assignment says here are the main goals. There are 4, and then they're reflected later. These are our main kind of objectives. I'm going to focus on these when evaluating your work. I want you to integrate research. I want you to synthesize sources. I want you to see how this transfers to other occasions. I want you to work on these specific conventions after you've discovered them. I want you to craft an introduction with recent news based on a question. And then you can see that the evaluation sheet is based on the rubric that they created. So each category has the introduction bubble says starts with recent news with a hyperlink to specific news story in the first sentence. Thesis is a question that's answerable. It's set up at the beginning. The question requires expertise to answer. It's not subjective. It's not answered by the news story. It doesn't argue. This seems really formulaic, but I get explained. I mean, the genre is a little bit formulaic in a lot of ways, but the students can write about any topic they want. They can ask any question they want. They can talk to any expert researchers they want to. And they created this rubric by reading multiple examples of the kinds of thing that they were going to write. So, and when I evaluate, they see this beforehand, so they know that this is how I'm going to do it. And I don't use points just because I feel uncomfortable saying that there's no question that equals 6 points. You know what I mean? I can't really do that for this particular assignment. For something like an annotated bibliography where I'm looking at things like citation, okay, yeah, you missed the year. You didn't put it in the year, minus 3 points or something like that.
So I have had issues with students where if you do assign points for excellent, good, satisfactory, and let's say your satisfactory does not equal a C in their point language, they will yell at you because that should be average. A C or a B is average, but those points, even though it's a 500-point class or whatever, does not equal an average grade. So I've gone away from giving points to categories and just putting a point range there, and you'll get whatever I feel like is in that point range that.
It allows you some discretion there.
Yeah, because.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a student who really was honing in on this. Your points do not equal what I think it should be an average grade. So you
You're a
have
student, you don't get to decide.
right. I mean, and I'm just like, that's not the point. That's not how this works. This is not.
Yeah.
But yeah, they get really. So I've gone away from assigning each one of those little things points, but more of like a whole point.
Yeah, that seems
So.
to give you more discretion there. I mean, I guess the other thing is too, the syllabus as another part of the suite here has to say things like, you know, maybe the university's grade breakdown, or even things like a C is average, or whatever the number is, and what does that number value here mean, and what do I have to do to just pass the class, you know, things like that. It could be worth thinking about what the syllabus does. That's that. And then this is the evaluation for this workshop. Grade me. I hope that the conversations that we had are enough to sort of get things going and take back to faculty in your departments and others and start some conversations that lead to more helpful tools. Like I said, I'll hook you up with example rubrics that you can look at, and the tools for like building rubrics if you want to try that out. If you have feedback, if after using any of those tools you want to let me know, get in touch. I'm at A. Thomas, easy to remember. If you want to talk further about any of these things, let me know. Thanks a lot for coming.